think there's always two elephants in the room when we are talking about the future. One is capitalism, our economic order. You can't look at what's happening in the world today without at least wondering whether or not our economic order is compatible with the future of life on the planet. And it was fabulous to see some discussion of that in this morning's session. The other elephant in the room, it seems to me, is actually justice, is social justice, because conversations about the future are conversations about politics and about power. And again, that was quite nicely recognised in the conversations we had this morning. Conversations about mobility are about not just, where people want to go and how they get there, but who gets to move. And so that's partially what I want to talk to you about today. So I'm going to talk about that second elephant in the room. I'm going to talk about social justice, which means I want to talk about money. And I want to talk about pricing. And the way I'm going to do that is to invite you to imagine a particular future of transport. It doesn't really matter whether you follow me all the way here, but I'm going to pitch you on a particular mobility future and talk a little bit about what that might mean for the pricing of transport. And then at the end of the presentation, I'm going to come back and talk about what we can learn from that for the future of mobility more generally. I should mention that this is based on joint work with a colleague at Monash University, Mark Howard, and I wanted to acknowledge his contribution here today. So I'm going to sketch a particular vision of the future of mobility. It's not that ambitious. People had much more exciting visions of the future of mobility this morning. Mine is a kind of a vision that's based around cars playing a large role. I hope that's not the case for some of the reasons that were discussed, but I think realistically we're still looking at the automobile as playing a large role in transport for some decades to come. But I'm going to imagine those cars as not having steering wheels anymore. I'm going to imagine driverless vehicles where the steering wheel has been taken away. A future in which it's become illegal to drive. I believe that it should be illegal for human beings to drive in the future, because I think that if you are building an autonomous vehicle and it's not as safe as human drivers, you shouldn't be allowed to put that on the road. If your vehicle is better than human beings at the driving task, then I think the human being has become like a drunk robot and shouldn't be allowed to be in control of a vehicle. And I'm imagining in the future, someone will get run over and there'll be a court case where the lawyers argue this child would still be alive except that you had chosen to put your hands on the steering wheel, because the autonomous vehicle, the driverless vehicle, would have braked. And you weren't as good. It's an unsafe vehicle for human beings in control. Now, of course, Elon Musk has made this argument recently. I want to say I got there first, but it's more compelling than you might acknowledge that if these systems are genuinely safer than human drivers, there's a real question about why we would allow human beings to drive. Now, there's other stories about how you might end up with lots of autonomous vehicles on the road. Then I'm going to imagine that because my car can drive itself, it makes no sense for me to own it. Because in the time that I'm not using it, I might as well hire it out to someone, put it into the sharing economy, it can drive around and pick up other people. Essentially, I'm imagining a fleet-based transport system, a mobility as a service transport system, based on shared driverless vehicles where you interact with an app. And you say, look, I'm dropping a pin, I want to go from here to here, and a car is sent to collect you. Maybe it picks up a few people along the way. Maybe it drops you at a bicycle station so you can get some exercise. None of that stuff really matters. I just want you to imagine, and presumably you've all imagined this already, a vision of the future in which people are able to move around the city by calling driverless vehicles to them that will take them where they want to go. So that's how much of the red Kool-Aid of driverless vehicles that I'm going to drink for the purpose of this presentation. Now, how would you price travel in that situation? Well, I think what you do, and I expect some of you are probably already plotting this yourselves, I think that you would price transport differentially. I think that you would take two people who wanted to make the same journey and give them the option of paying more or less for the journey, like the Uber model already. And so if I want to get from here to the airport more than you do, and we're equally wealthy, I pay more money for that journey, and this transport system that I'm imagining gets me there faster than you. Now, there's a couple of ways that you could do that. One is a central cloud-based system that maybe was developed because the ambulance and fire services wanted to be able to clear the roads in the context of emergencies. Maybe it's Boyd's Internet of Mobility that enables routes to be allocated to particular vehicles. So I get the slow route, you get the fast route. The central cloud server allocates us space on the road. So that's one way you might do it. And then if I pay more, I get a better route. Another way you might do this is if you can control enough of the fleet and your vehicles can speak to each other, then I can influence journey times across the road network. Because when two people who've both hired my vehicles turn up to the intersection together, one of them's paid more. The person who's paid less, their car waits for the other one to pull out. So if we can control interactions between vehicles and they can talk to each other, and we've got a market in mobility, then I can give priority access to people who've paid more using that situation. Now, there's all more mundane ways we can do this. We can just send vehicles more quickly to people who've paid more. If you are into a future in which there's no traffic lights and there's online markets, online bidding wars to see who gets to go through the intersection at a particular time, that will also generate priority access for people who are wealthy. Now, at this point in the presentation, a couple of things happen. Some people say, yes, so what? It seems to me. There's a certain portion of the audience who just thinks that we've always wanted to price the roads. It's terribly inefficient that we don't make people pay the full cost of the externalities of their transport. Fantastic, let's get on with pricing access to the road network. Other people, I think, are a little bit less chilled about this possibility. But of course, there's a way in which we're already there. So let me talk a little bit about precedents and analogies. So many of you would be aware roads tend to go where wealthy people want to go. Urban planning is of course difficult. Demand for transport is complicated, but money talks in transport infrastructure. So there's a sense in which cities are already designed in ways that, for instance, privilege people who own cars, who tend to be wealthy, over people who don't own cars, who tend to be poorer. So in a sense, the city's already designed to differentially move people through urban space. You can have toll roads, and again, my hometown of Melbourne, our key infrastructure is a public-private partnership, and poor people tend not to use those roads because you have to pay extra money to go on the tollway. You could do congestion pricing. You could have the hot lanes, so-called hot lanes. So if you've got 4 people in the car, you get to use the priority access lane, and then of course suddenly people realise that you can pay money on your mobile phone to use the priority access lane, and you've got a version of what I'm describing already. Many of you will have flown here today and watched wealthier people get onto the plane first. In fact, the really wealthy people, you don't even see them at the airport because they just get whisked out of their limousines into their private jets and arrive before you do. So there's all sorts of ways in which mobility is already priced in ways that make it harder for poor people to move around. Now, here's one that you mightn't like so much, which is the idea that the poor should simply have to doff their caps and get out of the way of wealthy people when they see them walking in the street. Because the history of Europe, actually, and of Asia, has these historical moments where if the nobility were on a procession moving through the town, all the commoners had to get out of the way or they got beaten with sticks. So you could just be making way for the nobles. And that one's a bit less comfortable. You know, we've kind of got used to, you know, priority access at the airport, but the idea that a wealthy person is walking through the streets and there's a couple of thugs in front of them with big long sticks poking you out of the way, that doesn't look quite so attractive. There's some analogies here with what's been happening in the world of telecommunications and the debate about net neutrality, because of course people want to price data like this. Data moves around the world. You could give people who are prepared to pay more better internet services, and there's actually been a remarkable amount of resistance to that idea, particularly in the public space in America. So what I'm saying, in a sense, I think is not that radical. We're already seeing mobility priced, access to public space priced, and in the future, we might see the entire urban infrastructure essentially priced differentially for people, if anything like what I've described eventuates. Maybe that wouldn't be so good. So now there's a connection here between my sort of remarks about capitalism and my remarks about social justice, because what we think about markets in transport turns on what we think about the justice of markets more generally. And, you know, we're a market society. We've accepted markets right across a whole range of social goods. I still think that you might feel a little bit uneasy at the idea that the roads, which are in a sense quite egalitarian, you know, you're in your Rolls Royce or your Lamborghini, I'm in my terrible old bomb, but I feel like I'm your equal on the roads. I don't have to give way to you. I might in fact make you give way to me because I'm more willing to damage my vehicle than you are. There's a sense in which at the moment in public space we meet as equals and we say, hey, we have equal right to move through space. In the future I'm describing that wouldn't be true, or at least it would be, our right to move through space would be affected by our ability to pay, and some people are never going to be able to pay for the privileged access. So I think this might be quite bad psychologically. I think that if you discovered yourself sitting at the lights and watching every other vehicle move in front of you, that would be a pretty depressing experience. That there would be a relationship between your economic circumstances and your sense of self-worth in society that would be quite destructive. So one of the things that might be wrong with markets in mobility is that they have these destructive psychological and social aspects. Now there's a couple of ways around that. One is just make it so that people don't notice, in the way that most of us don't notice when the really wealthy are at the same airport as us because they just don't share our space at all. Or maybe we just get used to it. In the same way that you're used to seeing all the people with their sort of platinum cards get on the plane before you do, maybe in the future you'll just be used to waiting at the intersection while everybody else moves through the intersection first. I still think that would be problematic. And I think it would be problematic because of what it says about our relationship to each other as citizens. What does it mean to be equal? What does it mean to be free and equal citizens in a democracy when something as basic as your ability to move has been monetized in the way that I've described? There's also a sinister aspect to this. I mean, I kind of, Internet of Mobility sounds great. I suspect it is great. But notice that someone has designed that system. And that system is probably, the way in which that system operates is probably invisible to you. The toll roads, the high occupancy lanes, the airport queues are visible signs of inequality. And we can recognise, and maybe we can do something about that. But an invisible electronic infrastructure that governs who gets to move through space, that seems a little bit more sinister, it seems to me. And it's the kind of thing that there should be public contestation about. And in fact, the history of attempts to introduce congestion taxes and to do road pricing is really interesting, because all the transport economists love it. Lots of environmentalists love road pricing. There seems to be some really good reasons to try to introduce more price signals into the road network, but the public doesn't like it very much at all. And these proposals are routinely voted down. In part, I think, because people have this really strong sense that they feel that the city should serve them equally, and they demand a right to share public space, to share space with other people as equals. So there might be something a bit sinister about building this sort of differential mobility into the infrastructure of the city in a way that's effectively invisible to citizens. Maybe. Now, the other aspect, of course, is in extending the market, you are privatising the roads. And you're privatising all the roads. Notice that this won't be a complete privatisation, of course, because it's not economic to build the regional and suburban roads. This will essentially be publicly funded roads that are then made available through a marketised system to the advantage of private mobility service providers. But in a sense, at the moment, it's just the arterial roads, the trains, wherever you've got first class, second class tickets, it's limited. In your suburban streets, you meet as equals. In the future, all of that stuff, it seems to me, would be privatised if the future that I've described comes about. So maybe that's not so good. Again, it depends on your politics. I'm actually not going to make a particularly strong conclusion here. I'm just interested to bring to people's attention these questions of pricing, which seem to me just around the corner. So, good or bad? I mean, in a sense, I just want to leave this up to you. It does seem to me that you could think of what I've described as a bug. Terrible, terrible thing. We need legislative action to ensure that people are not given privileged access to what's currently shared public space on the basis of a willingness to pay. And that should be designed into the sort of internet of mobility. Or you could say, it's a feature. Fantastic, at last we can have economically rational use of the roads. That's going to depend upon your attitude towards markets more generally. But notice the bigger picture here. The way in which what looks like a technology, and maybe none of what I've said will happen. I suspect we will still see price signals used to distribute transport through the internet of mobility. That seems to me a very natural use of that technology is to enable people to pay more for the road. So you don't need to buy the full scenario to think that there's some interesting stuff to be thinking about here. Do we want to live in a world which is like the world we do in fact live in, where access to something that feels quite fundamental, our bodies moving through space, are now controlled by a transport infrastructure that privileges some people over others? Or do we want to think, here are these matters of social justice, and here's a moment where we might insist on an egalitarian solution? So I've just tried to draw your attention to these questions of social justice. As you start to roll out your wonderful new transport solutions, think about the pricing structure and think about what that means for people who are poor and people who are excluded, as well as for the advantages that we might get through efficient uses of scarce resources. I thank you for your time.